Hey, welcome back. You are watching Cherie and Elizabeth Talk Sports. I am Cherie Louise Turner, and I host and produce the podcast Strides Forward. And I am here with Elizabeth Emery, who hosts and produces Hear Her Sports podcast. And how are you doing this week, Elizabeth?
I'm doing really well. Spring is here, but it's
Yes.
hilarious. Even though spring is here, I'm going to talk about Berkey, the American Birkebeiner race event that I did on February 25th. And I'll have to tell you that when I signed up for it, almost a year ago, literally, it fills up really
Wow.
quick. So we signed up early. I had no idea what a big event it was, but it's a weekend of kiddie races and ski joring and pancake breakfasts and pasta dinners and junior races and group events and all this stuff. And of course, the three sort of main events that happen on the American Birkebeiner Trail. And those include a 15K, the Korte, which is 30K, which is what I did. It was 29K. And then the main event, the 50K Berkey. And the organization was just so fantastic. So it was really fun to be there. And the town, it goes from Cable, Wisconsin, way up north in Wisconsin, to Hayward, Wisconsin, and all the towns really embrace the event. I'm sure it brings a ton of money, but it also is just something that they really enjoy to host. And so that's really nice. Like at a point in the race, sort of later in the race, we crossed over the highway, and all of the cars were like honking as they could see us crossing over this bridge. And it was just so fantastic. And, as I said, it was later in the race. So I was like, yay, I need that little energy. So that was good. But, I think a lot about what I get from competition
Hmm.
because, I'm not competing for the win or anything. So what do I get? And one thing that I was reminded during doing the Berkey was that always in competition, I'm pushed to the limit and sort of pushed past my limits that I self impose. So, like usually when I'm doing descents, I'm very controlled, but during the Berkey, I just like completely let it rip. And we had really worked on our wax, so it was really fast. And, like I hope I take that with me. I hope that's the new normal now. Like often when you compete and you discover, oh, like I can go in that way or that much harder or whatever it is. So that was what I got from competing this past week. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. I get the same out of competing where it just puts you in a different mindset and you're
Yeah.
focused on something else. And it's just, yeah, it really can bring out the best in you or bring out more in yourself than you realized you had, or it's just a different space and it's exciting. I'm glad
Yeah.
you had a good time. I'm really
Yeah.
glad that
It,
you
it
had a
was
good
really
time.
fun.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
well,
And you, how are you
yes,
doing?
I'm good. I'm good. So I have one small thing and then I'll get to the main thing that I wanted to talk about. One small thing is that there was the Tokyo Marathon over the weekend. And I just have to say for the record that the women's coverage was absolutely terrible. Everybody is talking about how terrible it was. And it's just another example of, here you have one of the best marathon runners in the world. Bridget Kozai won the race, third fastest marathon ever run by a woman, course record for a woman, just phenomenal performance. And as she was coming into her finish, they were at the men's award ceremony
Oh my God.
doing an interview. Yeah, with Kipchoge, which, you know, an absolutely incredible athlete, but we saw his whole race. We saw his move, we saw him win, we saw everything about what he did. And, we missed the move in the women's race. And the coverage was just absolutely terrible. And I was watching it in a group and found myself just like, I was really mostly interested in the women's race, and there was so little of it that I just ended up kind of drifting off and having conversations and not paying very close attention because I was like, wow, you're clearly not going to show what I want to see. And then when we were all really fixed, ready to watch the women's finish, we didn't get to see much of it, so that was very disappointing. And I'll just add one more thing is Alphine Tillamook, who was one of the Olympians for the US in the marathon this last Olympics. Um, put up something about, like, if you're going to be one of the major marathons, why don't we institute equal coverage of men and women? Because this is just absolutely ridiculous. And a lot of people have, retweeted her message and are
Mhm.
on board with that. So I think, you know, there just has to be some sort of mandates because it was just absolutely absurd. It was a stellar field and they got nothing. So yes, keep cutting you
So
off.
that's quite all right. So three things. One, I think like that's why media coverage matters is
Yes.
because like you went off and did something else because
Right.
what you were wanting to see was not going to be. So that's again, I just like, like that's why it matters. And then two, I'm like, who the hell put this on? Like why is this such a difficult why is it difficult? Why do
Right.
they not already know in 2022 that you don't show some damn interview rather than the women's finish? Like,
Yeah. And what
why does anyone have to point that out?
right.
Like,
Yeah, and also, like, have the award ceremonies after the races finish.
right.
Just
It's
like
not
this
that
is
hard. Again, it is not that hard.
yeah, so that was not the main thing I wanted to talk about, but I felt
But I'm glad you
like
did.
I would
Yes.
be remiss if I didn't say something because it's just like, "Oh,
Yeah.
come on." Um,
I want to
so
find out who's responsible for that though.
I
I
would
mean,
be curious too.
I mean, not to like go after that person, but like just as a point of knowledge, like, was it a man? Was it a woman? Who was making those decisions? How does that happen? Like, cause I totally don't understand that world and how these decisions that, we sit here and think like, how could that happen? 2022, obviously it did happen. So what is the mechanism? What is the system that is still allowing for that to happen?
Right, and there were a few people that brought up that, well, it's a different culture and they don't value women in sports as much, but I'm just like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, but this is a world
It's
majors."
global, right?
Yeah, and so it's not like, oh, that culture is in charge of all of this. It's like, but this
Right.
is part of something that people the world over participate in, and it's run by the same organization. It's overseen by the same organization that is involved with the Boston Marathon, New York City,
Oh,
and
wow.
the five
Interesting.
majors, right? So why isn't there consistency across the broadcasting for
Sure.
these very important events?
How
So
were you guys watching?
I was watching it was a group watching situation through Tracksmith, and we were at
Okay.
their Tracksmith clubhouse. So I don't know what feed they were using, but it sounded like everybody who was complaining was watching the same thing. So I don't know. I don't know who
One,
is broadcasting it.
yeah.
There were some people who pointed out that they found some free feeds in various places where the coverage was actually better. So, but I don't know the various different ways people were watching, but I think we were watching whatever conventional way most
Right.
everybody else was watching.
Okay.
So, well, the main thing I wanted to talk about was injury, because I am going through a bit of an injury, and it's largely a good story, but I was reminded that I am terrible as an injured person because as soon as it happened, it was a little Achilles strain that happened during my 800 the last time I ran or the last time I raced, and I was just immediately in a terrible mood, and I was depressed and upset and just it was an awful feeling. And luckily there was somebody at the meet who was able to give me some ways to move forward, and she helped me ice it, and but still you never know how these things will go. But I'm terrified of something wrong happening with my Achilles. So I was really, really like clear with myself that I was going to do everything that everybody told me to do that sounded like good advice. And so I did those things, and I pushed it a little bit too much last week. And so I a little bit paid for it. But largely, I have been doing all the right things that everyone has told me with appropriate rest and ice and the exercises and everything. And you know what? It's getting better really fast.
Oh, that's good.
And so I guess that's my takeaway is that, well, when I'm feeling like I did the right thing, and I've been really, really mindful of just trying to listen to my body and trying to listen to good advice and do the right things. And and also things like keep up my nutrition, because like nutrition is really important when your body is healing, and recognizing that even though you're taking maybe a little more rest, your body is really hard at work trying to heal, and just really, really, really trying to do the right things as opposed to what I'd rather do, which is just go out and keep training hard and hope everything works
Right.
out okay.
Right. I can't see it. So
Right. So I'd like to say that, this is my message of like, I don't know, like do the right things when you're injured and hopefully it will work out for the best. Like I
yeah.
don't know. So I feel like I've done the wrong thing many, many times.
Many times, and me too. And but you bring up an interesting point that I think being injured and as an athlete is so hard. And for me, in many ways, that's like how athletes respond to being injured or sick or whatever it is really marks them as good athletes, like really super strong athletes. But as you pointed out, you had all these people helping you, which
Yes.
indicates how important it is to have a good team. It's not during the good days you need those people. It's, when you're struggling and wanting to go out, and run a billion miles on an injury that you need
Well,
somebody to say, like, really, that's probably not wise.
yeah, and one of the things, and I don't know if I'm just I could be very much so that I'm lucky and I'm surrounded by smart people who know what they're talking about when they give this advice, but I got the same exact advice from two separate people personally who I was talking
Mm,
to. And then when I looked online, I found the same advice. So I guess what that indicates is yes, I'm lucky, but looking online, anybody could look up people, and so it also makes me think that maybe just in general, we're giving good advice to people. I'm hoping that's the case. Because pretty much it was like lots of people said the same thing about the active treatment of, this particular tendon and how to deal with it. So that was nice as well.
yeah. I
Um,
think I think it's easy to get your sort of your mind skewed. And so, you can look online and one person says, "Oh, you should go out and run 10 miles." And that's what you're going to go with.
well, especially if
When
it's what you want to do.
exactly my point. Yeah, exactly my point. So, yeah, I think
So
I am always an advocate of really good coaching and really good support team.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So largely a good story. And I
Well,
also
congratulations. That's great.
Thank you. And the other thing that I was thinking about a lot being injured is that I'm going to take it as an opportunity to learn where the stress points are in this new activity of
Hmm.
running really fast on a track. Like because that was my weak point. I'm running in different shoes and even though I thought I was easing into them smartly and slowly enough, I clearly was not. And so I'm using that as an opportunity to understand what my weak points are so going forward I'll know what to work on.
Right.
And so I'm trying
Great.
to have a little more positive framing of what an injury can provide
Yeah.
other than just tears.
There's also a big difference between going fast and all of that impact
Mhm.
versus sort of just going at a tempo pace. Huge difference in
Yeah.
terms of the strain on your body.
Yeah, and you really only get to do it like, a few times. Like you just don't put those efforts in to at that distance. Like you only do your race when you do your race.
Right.
Like you might go do a
Right.
couple time trials beforehand, but not many because they're
Yeah.
devastating on you. They really wipe you out.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, well, moving on, we're just briefly going to talk about one of my episodes from my show, Strides Forward, for our podcast highlight this week. And I chose the episode, it's from way back when I first started. It's of Blanche Moyla and the Comrades Marathon, and just a very brief backgrounder. So, the Comrades Marathon is the oldest and longest running, well, yes, oldest ultra marathon in the world. It's been going on since 1921. It's in South Africa. It's a road ultra marathon and it's roughly 90 kilometers, so about 56 miles. And Blanche Moyla has run this race for many, many, many years for charity, and she's also acted as a mentor. But her real claim to fame, and she is a Black South African, and that is important because her real claim to fame is she is the first Black female athlete to be on the national team for South Africa, and that was during apartheid.
Yeah.
So she became very famous. She was an amazing cross country runner, and she actually excelled in the shorter distances. But she's a legend over there, and she has, been honored. She continues to be honored all the time, and she is held in high esteem over in South Africa. And the reason why I chose to talk about her is I think it's because I've got women's sports history on my mind because it's going to be the 50th year of women being able to run the Boston Marathon this year. That opened up to women in 1972. And so I've been thinking a lot about the women who came before us and, just how we really need to honor these people, and what they did was so important. And one of the things I'll point out, and then I will ask you about your impressions of it, but one of the things that really struck me is how she talks about, she was very famous at the time that Nelson Mandela and other people in the ANC in South Africa were in prison, and that seeing her come into the spotlight and become a part of the national team gave them hope. And
Hmm.
it's just really points to how sports goes beyond the racing and the sport and inspires other things. And in this case, it inspired world leaders to continue having hope when they were in prison during this incredibly horrible, horrible time of their country's history. So that's why I wanted to bring it up. Now, what's your impression there, Elizabeth?
Uh, I love talking about women's history in sports, and I think it is so important. And sometimes I think that I'm like just this old lady thinking, like you have to listen to your elders. But I do think it's important, even as I honor the young people who are saying, I'm not going to stand for this crap anymore. I think it is important that we still know where we came from.
Yeah.
So I do like talking about history. One of the things that I thought about was she was very lucky. She ran as a young person, but when she was in nursing school, it was actually a friend of hers, a doctor, who noticed her and said, you have talent. And that's one thing I've learned hosting and producing Hear Her Sports is that, I mean, literally 99% of the women that I've interviewed have had that one person who has sort of said, hey, you can do this. And wow, that's something that we can all do for younger people or other
Right.
people. And, just point out that they do have this exceptional talent, or even if their talent is just an interest, to point out that it's worth continuing in that interest. So that definitely stuck out for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then, oh, the other thing that I noticed was that she gained a lot of sort of personal power and confidence doing
Yes.
sports. And I think that's one thing that maybe isn't talked about enough or sort of discussed at how it works. I just think about when I started retraining sort of more actively and how much I appreciated what my body could do when I was doing that and
Mm.
enjoying it. And then seeing the sort of trickle down of how my own personal sense of what my body was able to do versus what society thought my body could do or should do was helped me in other areas of my life.
I absolutely agree. And yeah, and it was interesting because she was not a real outspoken person as a young person. She was shy, she was a bookworm,
Right.
and she is not that anymore. You wouldn't think that about her today because she's very outspoken. She speaks a lot to young people, she mentors young women, and she's just very involved in sport and getting girls especially into
Right.
sport. So, yeah, so I
I
wanted to
also
highlight that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
and
go
I
ahead.
also really like that the entire Comrades series because it's such a great insight into the race obviously, but also just being in South Africa.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's so much I I try to get across, and I think it's hard if you've never been there, but what a big deal that event is.
Hmm.
And the best description, and I've heard many people say this, so I go back to it, is that it's like the Super Bowl of South Africa, but the difference is it's a Super Bowl that anybody can enter.
Right, right,
Right, like, anybody can participate, it's on TV for 12 hours straight live, like, it is just it's a huge national holiday. I mean, it is an incredibly big deal. So, yeah, I mean, super privileged to get to talk to people who have done it and been influential in that race, and then just you get to hear a lot about just South Africa in general. So, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
thank you. Thanks
cool,
for pointing that out because it's one of
cool.
the reasons I loved why I made 12 episodes around one
Right.
race. So now we're going to move on to sort of the main subject for the week. And this week I chose yet another podcast episode. I was really taken with it. And the podcast is called The Business Case for Women's Sports. And it is created and hosted by Carolyn Fitzgerald. And she started a company called Goals, and it's the first ever sponsorship consultancy company that is solely focused on bringing more investment into women's sports. Just to give a sense of the larger picture here. And
Mhm.
in the episode that we're going to talk about is she has a conversation with Angela Ruggiero, who we have mentioned many times before because she is a big influence on this whole space of women in sports. And they talk about her project, the Fan Project, and in essence, what this project was that they invited people who were sports fans of women's sports to share their social media so that they could basically data mine it. So this was with consent. They went into these people's accounts, and the goal was to get a picture of what the sports fan actually looks like. And Ruggiero points out in the interview that usually when they're looking for data, they do surveys. And she said, well, what we wanted to do was, instead of asking people what they thought or what they might do, we were going to look at what they actually did. And it turned out to be incredibly interesting for them. And they had all sorts of interesting takeaways from being able to provide this profile of the women's sports fan, men and women. Of course, they didn't just look at women who watch women in sports. And yeah, they are basically making the case for, this is a great investment, and here is how you can market to these people. And one of the, to my mind, one of the very smart things that they do is they not only provide information through this report about what that sports fan looks like and how they behave, but also here's a path forward. Um, so I wanted to bring this up, a, because I love the fan project, and I loved this conversation, and I really do like Carolyn's her whole podcast. All the interviews are really interesting
Really good, yeah.
that I've listened to, but this one in particular, because this is the first time somebody's done something like this. And I'll tell you, one of the main things that really struck me was that there is now data around how the sports fan for women's sports is different from the sports fan for men's
Exactly.
sports.
That's what I got too.
Yeah,
So
so I'd love
fascinating.
to hear, yeah, I want to hear your takeaway from it.
It was exactly that, and I don't really know the specifics because I have not looked at the report yet, but, it she called what did she call it? She said, "Oh, you shouldn't lift and shift,"
Yeah.
sort of the same idea of shrinking and pinking it. So,
Yes.
like, we have to stop thinking about just like taking what we have used for so many years for the men's sports fan and transferring it directly to the women's sports fan. And that was what was so beautiful about this project, is it showed with data, I love data,
Yes. Yes.
that's not how it works. And the women's sports fan is way different. And in terms of money, one of the things that she was talking about is how, who wants to invest in the women's sports will often sort of miss the best way to do that, because they're not necessarily shifting and lifting, but their mindset is still on the male framework.
Right.
And so they're not understanding what they can gain from the women's side. And often that's sort of a deeper fan, somebody
Right.
who's more intensely involved. And so they're still looking at the model of the male fan, and it's all about numbers. Like, we want the most numbers we can, when on the women's side you get more for each person who's
Right.
involved, because like, one of the examples she gave was how long a man will watch some sport event versus how long a woman will watch, and it's like ridiculously different. And like, I can't remember the numbers, but you know very short time for the man, and I think it was 85% of the game women were watching.
Yeah, I remember that part of the episode, and one of the other things was that they compared the women's watching to men watching a playoff game. So, like, an
Yes.
important
Yes.
game, and the men were sticking around. I wanna say it was for 63% of the game, and women were sticking around for a non-play, so theoretically
Right,
not
right.
as important of a game, even longer. So, yeah, I mean, just showing it really was making the case for, like, if you're marketing to women the same way that you market to men, or you're marketing to people who are interested in women's sports, I should say, because those can be men too,
Right.
or non-gender conforming people as well. Like, if you're doing the same thing, you aren't going to get good results. And the other thing that she pointed out too that I thought was really interesting was that you have to measure differently.
Right, yeah,
And so it's
yeah.
just a whole different program.
Mhm,
And so it does point to the fact that, like, here's some reasons why the conventional ways that people have been trying to market to women just aren't working. And and it's a path forward. So it was just really exciting. And one of the other interesting takeaways that wasn't so surprising, but they do have now the data to back it up, was the fact that, like, there's a lot of stats in the way that we report on men's sports, and women don't respond as well to that, or they're not as interested as they are in storytelling.
mhm.
And also pointing out that women sports fans are very tech savvy, because we have to be, because we don't get that straight ahead, like, we can turn on the TV and watch our sport of choice. Like, we have to join communities, and we have to subscribe to these niche newsletters, and we have to really dig around to find our information.
Right.
So, yeah.
What do you think about the whole idea of women liking storytelling more than men? Because I remember, and I've talked about this in the past, I remember the NBC Up Close and Personal in during the Olympics, and I don't remember what Olympics it was. I was a kid, so probably sometime in the 70s, and I hated it.
Yeah.
I absolutely hated it. I still don't like it. So I, like I have this bit of cringe when I hear that women don't like stats and women like storytelling and men don't, and I don't know. I need to think about that a little more.
Yeah, and I was thinking similarly, because there are a lot of sort of storytelling, like, features in sports coverage that I feel like they're, like, trying to go after the, I don't know,
Exactly.
softer side of sport.
Yeah.
I don't know how to couch it, but I do understand what you're saying, and I don't like it either. But there is, like, good, like, documentary style storytelling that I think is really good, and that's what I'm hoping was their finding, that that's what
Right.
people like me and you like, because I do like quality storytelling,
Sure.
and I also kind of liken that to quality journalism. And so, yeah, so I think, for me, it would be nice to see a little better breakdown of, like, well, what do you mean by storytelling as opposed to stats? Because I think those two things can merge quite nicely,
Right.
and I like a good stat too. So, but I don't want to
Yeah.
be like, I'm not going to sit there and, I don't know, study RBI stats
No,
for
no, no, no,
so stuff
no.
like that bores me to tears. But, you know, I, I like things couched in data and,
Right. I
factual
also think that
information.
we're so early on still,
Yes.
in figuring out what women want to watch in terms of sports and blah blah blah. So it gets me to think about Cheryl Cookie's vending machine again.
Yes. Yeah.
If the person is offered, the person that is sharing their data is offered stats that are going to bore you to tears, or a story, even if it's a story that you don't like that much, like you're good, you're probably going to choose a story, and then all of a sudden, women like stories better, when
Right.
in fact that's not really the truth. I don't know if we're yet offering women what they really, really, really want to see in sports coverage.
Yeah. The other thing that became a question mark to me when I was listening to this is, it's like, okay, well, women are savvy with finding coverage because we have to be, but how will that shift when women's sports coverage is more accessible?
Mm,
As we all hope it will be. Like, I really hope that we don't all have to be digging around for just the smallest amount of basic information about like who won a race or,
Right. Right.
so I do wonder if that will shift. Like we're savvy now because we don't have a choice. Like you don't have a sports fan who follows certain, especially certain types of women's sports without digging around because you just can't be. Like I can learn all sorts of stuff about football just by going downstairs to my gym because ESPN gets turned on,
Right, of
right?
course, yeah.
So I can
Or turn on
absorb
the
something.
radio or whatever it is.
Right.
It's everywhere, yeah.
Yeah, so what if that starts to shift and women are more involved in those conversations? Will we be as savvy?
Right.
Yeah, and so and like you say, like as the coverage develops, what is it going to look like that we enjoy?
Right. Like when
Yeah,
we're offered 10 different versions of storytelling, which one are we gonna choose?
right. What type? Yeah, what's going to but what an exciting thing to try and figure out.
Yes.
So,
Yeah. It's
yeah.
awesome. It's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah, so it was just, it was just great to hear it was great to hear Angela Ruggiero go into, what this project was all about and what they had found, and it's the first one. Like, it's so exciting.
Yeah. And, this is obvious, but Angela is a woman. She's a female person. So she's directing this study, which has never been done before. Again, it goes back
Yeah,
to we need more women in positions where they can ask the questions,
yeah,
support the questions, finance the questions, and get the
right.
answers that we need to start this conversation, make sure it goes deeper.
Yeah, yeah, and it does remind me of what we talked about last week, which was all the data that Gina Davis got that was
Yeah.
presented in the movie that we talked about, This Changes Everything. And, it was a woman with
She's a woman
money
too.
who went and got the data. And so it's exciting. It's
Yeah.
exciting because then I've even had some moments of just like, well, what data do I want to go after? Right? Like what do,
Yeah.
and who knows? I've got ideas.
Oh,
So
good.
so it does, but it sparks the conversation, it sparks the idea, it sparks the wow, if we could just spend like they put a huge amount of effort into that, but they got that report done in 5 months, right?
Wow.
In
Yeah.
I mean it's that's pretty incredible. And obviously, like, there are a lot of powerful people who have a lot of connections and, it's not like anybody could just step in and like make this report, but the fact that a lot of this stuff has never been done, it's like, well, people can step in and do a little bit of reporting or investigating. Even the reporter from Variety who did that really great article that we talked about last week, uh, she was one reporter that did her
Yeah.
own investigation and she didn't
Yeah.
have a big team of people, so it can be done. Anyway, it's made me very excited just to see
Yeah.
these moves and making good business cases. The one last thing that I'll say, one of the other takeaways that I really liked is that Angela Ruggiero knows what the investment people need to make the case that
Right.
this is a good investment and that it's not a charity and that it's not we're going to look good because we're investing in women's sports and that's a nice thing to do. It's like, no, we're doing this because it's smart
And
and
we're
we're
gonna
going to
make
get
some
ahead of
money.
the
Yeah.
curve and we're going to make some money that's just sitting there waiting to be spent if we could funnel it to us.
It also gives, the few people that are at these companies ammunition to make
Yes.
their case, which hasn't
Yes.
hasn't been true before this project. It was just and that's why I think it became this sort of the idea that it was charity or you were doing a favor because there was no way to support any of this information. I'm sure people had hunches that there was a lot of money on the table, but now there's actual proof,
Right.
which always makes a
Right.
huge difference.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And, undeniable proof. So,
Exactly.
yay.
Yeah.
Well, fantastic. I think we have reached the end of yet another week of talking about women in sports and the media. And yeah, always such a pleasure.
Always great to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I am Cherie Turner of Strides Forward, and I'm here with Elizabeth Emery
Talk
of
to you
Hear Her
soon.
Sports. Talk to you next week.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.